Welcome to Carey Open, a podcast where we open a window into the world of Carey Baptist College.
Ladies and gentlemen, sorry I can address you only in English. However, I have learned a couple of fresh words this evening, zoomies and roomies. I shall use those on future occasions. Let me also say what a pleasure it is to be in this city of Auckland. When I flew in from Australia yesterday at the airport, I was much struck by the official at the passport checking centre. He ushered me through very courteously. When he noticed that my passport said I was born in Nottingham, he immediately asked, was I a supporter of Forest or County? It's an extraordinary wisdom on his part. The two football clubs that play in Nottingham. How did he know? I didn't ask. I admired the fund of general knowledge which clearly exists in this city. So thank you very much to the institution for inviting me. Thank you to you for coming and for those who are online as well. Subject today is Evangelical Christianity and the Enlightenment. Evangelical Christianity is that type of Protestantism which is orthodox in belief and evangelistic in practice. Possesses a gospel that it is eager to spread. It's possible, however, to offer a closer characterization of the movement. There are four features that evangelicals have emphasized over time, and together they form a quadrilateral of its basic characteristics. First is conversionism. This is the belief common to all evangelicals that people are not naturally Christians. Rather, they have to turn to Christ if they're to become true believers. This has normally been the burning message of the evangelical movement. In the period of its greatest growth in America during the Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century, this was the gospel challenge that rang out long into the night around the fires at the camp meetings. Equally, G.W. McCree, a London Baptist minister of the mid-19th century, gave priority to conversion in his preaching. He held, according to his son, that conversion was far above and of greater importance than any denominational differences of whatever kind. That view was entirely typical of evangelicals. Conversion, they insisted, is not the outcome of a person's own efforts. It is the result of justification by faith, that is, a simple trust in Jesus Christ that makes people acceptable to God. The message of justification by faith, revived by the evangelical revival after a period of quiescence, was very much the theme of the Reformation. It scandalised many of the clergy of the Church of England mainstream in the 18th century. There was no need for good works to be done, evangelicals seem to be saying, for salvation to be received. Therefore, their opponents concluded there was no incentive to virtue. Why bother doing anything good at all? Evangelicals brought down on themselves denunciation as traducers of the law of God. Justification by faith was insisted on as the only means of conversion, the first characteristic of evangelical Christianity. Secondly, activism is a fundamental characteristic of evangelicals. Apologists for the movement in the 18th century claimed that they did not neglect good works. Certainly true that evangelicals went about performing all sorts of humane works of charity. They insisted that conversion brings a new motivation to do good and so leads to true holiness. Consequently, they were activists. Their activism consisted primarily in spreading the gospel. In addition, they normally, though not absolutely consistently, engaged in philanthropy of various kinds. The activism often ran very deep. John Wesley expected preachers to be active for more than 100 hours per week. It's no wonder that the Methodists early in their existence created what they called the Worn-Out Ministers' Fund. When we pray for the advancement of this kingdom, wrote Caleb Evans, a leading late 18th century Baptist with reference to the Lord's Prayer, if we're not willing to do all we can to advance it, our prayers cannot be genuine. In the third place, evangelicalism over time has been biblicist. The Bible has been the authority for the message, the source of all truth about God. Consequently, according to many evangelicals, theology is not a discipline where knowledge advances significantly. Sir Robert Inglis, the evangelical Anglican Member of Parliament, made a memorable pronouncement at the House of Commons in 1850. A Unitarian had said in a debate that recent theological discoveries should be taught in the universities. Inglis exploded with the cry that all the truths of religion are to be found in the blessed Bible. Alleged discoveries in theology, went on, were worth neither teaching nor hearing. This rather wooden attitude is not the only view that evangelicals have professed. Their respect for the Bible has often encouraged academic study of the Scriptures. A good example is F.F. Bruce, a member of the Brethren, founder of the Tyndale House Library for Biblical Research in Cambridge in 1945, and subsequently Rylands Professor of Biblical Exegesis in the University of Manchester. Popular devotion to the Bible is an even more important dimension of evangelical biblicism than scholarly activity. There was the tradition inherited from the Puritan past of a family Bible containing a family tree on its flyleaf being opened daily for a reading by the head of the household. Sometimes evangelicals have taken devotion to Scripture almost beyond the bounds of legitimacy. John Nelson, an early Methodist preacher, was accused of making the Bible his God. Whatever the details of the specific attitude, biblicism must be seen as a characteristic of evangelicals. Fourthly, evangelicals have been crucicentric in their faith. They have placed at the centre of their theological scheme the doctrine of the cross, the atoning work of Jesus Christ in his death. The outstanding leader of Anglican evangelicals in the early 19th century, Charles Simeon, preached a sermon before the University of Cambridge in 1811, which was entitled Christ Crucified or Evangelical Religion Described. The two parts of the title were equivalent. Why has the cross been central? It's because by the atonement, Jesus Christ achieved salvation, rescuing humanity from sin. Other theological perspectives are possible, even if there's a focus on the person of Christ. Anglo-Catholic theology for much of the 20th century dwelt on the incarnation of the Son of God. Again, liberal Protestants of the late 19th century commonly concentrated on the example and teaching of Jesus. So in stressing the atonement, evangelicals have been distinctive. Normally, they have held that Jesus Christ died in the place of sinners, and so maintained a doctrine of substitutionary atonement. Thus, the greatest sermon of Robert Hall, the Baptist who was celebrated as the most eloquent of early 19th century English theologians, was a defence of the principle of the substitution of the innocent for the guilty. The cross is at the heart of evangelical theology. Four characteristics taken together form a set of emphases that mark evangelicalism. Other major teachings have been held from time to time. The elements have had a different balance at various periods, but nothing has been of consistently equal importance to these four attributes. Those who displayed these four features were evangelicals. The subject of this paper is the relationship of the evangelical movement to Western civilization. It has often been asked how evangelicals interacted with indigenous cultures in countries to which the gospel was transmitted by missionaries. Here the question is how evangelicals related to the Western culture of the societies that sent the missionaries in the first place. Western civilization was itself partly formed by the Christian religion. It has interacted over the long term with the classical legacy of antiquity to produce the main body of Western assumptions. Here, however, the subject is not the diffuse Christian inheritance of Western civilization, but rather the specific features of culture in the modern period. The 18th century was associated with the Enlightenment. That is not to claim that there was a precise correlation between that century and the movement of opinion. Indeed, that movement of opinion had its roots in the previous century, and it exerted a wide popular influence in subsequent centuries. The legacy was strong during the 20th century and remains so in many fields during the 21st. There is overlap between the movement and between it and what went before and what went after. Nevertheless, it is fruitful to look at that current of Western thought in the 18th and on into the 19th century, the Enlightenment. What was the Enlightenment? It was the era that emphasised the ability of human reason to discover truth. The commonly used equivalent is the age of reason. Descartes prepared the way for the Enlightenment in the 17th century, raising the question of how knowledge is obtained, epistemology, as the central issue in philosophy. Certainty, he argued, is possible only when knowledge is obtained on the pattern of mathematics, by deduction. John Locke was even more of a herald. His essay concerning human understanding, 1690, repudiated the notion of innate ideas, the supposition the mind already contains certain ideas before experience begins. Instead, Locke put the stress on experience itself. He held that since a child is born without any automatic knowledge, everything that is known comes from sense expressions from the external world. The impact of Locke was reinforced by that of Sir Isaac Newton and the whole scientific movement that gathered force during the later 17th century. Newton, especially by the discovery of gravity, did much to raise the prestige of natural science. Locke and Newton together exalted the method of induction in philosophy. General laws were to be established from the investigation of particular cases. In the light of successful scientific endeavour, it was thought legitimate to apply that technique not just to the natural world, but also to the human world. The Enlightenment can be seen as adopting that principle as its programme, the application of scientific method to the study of humanity. It is true that there was in the Enlightenment era an irrationalist countercurrent. Freemasonry, for example, with its eclectic semi-mystical worldview, was popular with the elite. But when that has been said, irrationalism was only a diversion from prevailing contemporary trends. The main thrust of 18th century thought, especially in the second half of the century, was the stress on the ability of reason to discover fresh knowledge. Was the Enlightenment irreligious in tendency? That has often been held, and certainly there were elements of Enlightened thought that pointed in that direction. The radical Enlightenment, stemming from Spinoza, a sceptical pantheist, was eager to discard inherited versions of theism. Many subsequent Enlightened thinkers held that human reason should be pitted against divine revelation. Thus Voltaire uttered his famous battle cry, "Écrasez l'infâme," destroy the infamous thing, by which he meant institutional religion. Voltaire was not an atheist, but a deist. He was one of the 18th century thinkers who believed that God had created the universe, but had then left it to operate by its own autonomous laws. Divine intervention in the world was ruled out. Many other significant figures of the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin among them, held that deistic position. Even within the churches, there was undoubtedly a similar liberalising trend in theology. Joseph Priestley, an English Presbyterian minister as well as a renowned chemist, expounded the view that existing Christianity had suffered corruptions over the centuries and so needed fundamental reappraisal in a rational direction. His Socinianism entailed a rejection of the doctrine of the Trinity and so led on to the Unitarian tradition. In the Church of England, there were clergy who, while formally adhering to its 39 articles of religion, held views that made Christianity closer to ancient philosophy than to biblical teaching. Such broad-minded divines are sometimes called latitudinarians. Because of the growth of deism, Socinianism, and latitudinarianism, the Enlightenment has often, quite plausibly, been seen as irreligious in tendency. At the very least, it has been portrayed as liberalising. It has therefore seemed natural to hold that evangelicalism, a mass religious movement displaying intense feeling, constituted a reaction against the Enlightenment. The age of reason was championed by members of the educated elite, Evangelicalism was a popular movement embraced by the ignorant. On this view, the early Methodists, embedded in traditional folkways, held irrational beliefs about local spirits, strange visions, and divine judgments. The historian E.P. Thompson, whose account of Methodism in his celebrated book, The Making of the English Working Class, 1963, has proved exceptionally influential, and he saw the movement as a form of mass psychological disorder. His portrayal has something to do with Thompson having been the son of a Methodist minister and turning from the religious atmosphere of his youth to a sophisticated version of Marxism. As a result, Methodism is commonly seen in historical literature as remote from rationality. The whole evangelical movement has been located as an expression of the religion of the heart in opposition to the Enlightenment's religion of the head. Evangelical Christianity has been reduced to a matter of mere feelings. This view rests on a serious misunderstanding. To posit a sharp contrast between evangelicalism on the one hand and the Enlightenment on the other is mistaken. It can be shown that, on the contrary, there was an affinity between the two. The existing Protestant tradition of the English-speaking world was remodelled during the 18th century by views with Enlightenment associations. The Puritans of the 17th century possessed many of the attributes subsequently taken up by the evangelicals, but they were conversionist, biblicist, and crucicentric. Their activism, however, was limited. Unlike 17th century Roman Catholics, the Puritans rarely made efforts to spread the gospel abroad. It is true that John Eliot did seek to evangelize the Native Americans of New England in the 17th century. He was an isolated instance, subsequently celebrated precisely because such enterprises had been unusual. The Puritans concentrated on preaching the gospel where it was already known. The shift to a sense of responsibility for mission throughout the world that marked the evangelical movement was the outcome of a shift in spirituality. Puritans, as Calvinists, believed in predestination. God had chosen some people for salvation, but not others. Individuals, however, did not know for sure whether or not they were numbered among the elect. In the 17th century, ministers deliberately encouraged their flocks to pursue their doubts over this question. Only so would their congregants wrestle with issues of faith until they trusted personally in Christ. There was a prevailing spirituality that fostered a lack of certainty about salvation. It is true that a doctrine of assurance was taught. It was held that people could know whether or not they were saved, but that assurance was expected to come late in the experience of the Christian as a result of times of anguish. The Westminster Confession of 1646 states, "This infallible assurance doth not so belong to the essence of faith, but that a true believer may wait long and conflict with many difficulties before he be a partaker of it." Assurance might well take time. The crucial matter was to look within for signs of saving grace in their souls. Priority, according to the Puritans, was introspective reflection, not bold mission. By contrast, evangelicals held a different type of spirituality. Assurance, according to evangelicals, is the regular possession of the believer. When John Wesley announced that assurance is given at conversion, he was widely criticised. Evangelical Anglican pioneers such as James Harvey and William Romaine spoke similarly. Some of them believed that assurance is a necessary part of saving faith, though others did not. What they held in common, however, was that assurance is normal, indeed normative, for the Christian. Hence, a believer was expected to be full of buoyancy, resilience, joy. Spirituality was transformed. Instead of concentrating on their own inward lives, looking for marks of grace, evangelicals turned outward to the world. They assumed their own salvation and confidently took up the task of spreading the gospel to others. That is why the modern overseas missions of the English-speaking world began only with the advance of evangelicalism. In 1792, William Carey, after whom this institution is named, launched the Baptist Missionary Society, and the following year went out to India. Congregationalists, Anglican evangelicals, and Methodists of England followed over the next few years, and soon the Americans were imitating their efforts to spread the gospel throughout the world. Missionary impulse was the fruit of the rise of evangelicalism. Why were evangelical Christians so confident in their faith? It's because they believed that they possessed self-evident knowledge. They were conscious that God had touched their lives as much as they were aware of any other sense experience. They believed that experience in the source of knowledge in exactly the same way as John Locke. They possessed an Enlightenment preoccupation with epistemology, which led them to affirm that God gave them indubitable knowledge of himself. The epistemological concern is evident in John Wesley. In the 1730s, he was a teacher of philosophy and logic at the University of Oxford, and as leader of the Holy Club, he was also dedicated to piety and good works. What he lacked was certainty. He asked himself, do I know God? It was not until he encountered the Moravians, German pietists, that he discovered that the knowledge of God comes through faith alone. That was what led to the experience of the 24th of May, 1738, when his heart was strangely warmed. He felt by sense experience the warmth of God's touch. Likewise, John's brother Charles incorporated the theme of sense experience in his hymns. How can a sinner know his sins on earth forgiven? Charles asks in one of them. What we have felt and seen, runs the answer. With confidence we tell. Christian experience is a matter of feeling or seeing. Wesley's possessed a confidence in knowledge derived from sense experience. The same was true of evangelical figures who, unlike the Arminian Wesleys, stood in the Reformed tradition. Jonathan Edwards, the congregational minister of Northampton, Massachusetts, was delighted when revival broke out in his parish in 1734. Instead of encouraging the new converts to doubt their salvation, he urged them to put away any fears that they were not among the elect. He adopted this policy because he held that the converts had acquired a new sense, his words, of God. An experience of the divine was worthy of confidence. Edwards should not be seen as a traditional Calvinist resisting the encroaching spirit of the Enlightenment. Rather, he was himself an Enlightenment thinker, adapting the received body of Protestant thought to the new modes of thinking in his day. His achievement was to blend piety with reason. Edwards's Freedom of the Will, 1754, defending Calvinism, rests on Locke's teaching. Edwards was remodeling the Reformed inheritance in accordance with the Enlightenment assumptions of the age. Other Calvinists in Scotland, England, and elsewhere followed his example and gained similar confidence about knowledge of God. Their movement was often called New Light. Light was equally that of the Gospel and of the Enlightenment. Consequently, there was a close bond between the evangelical movement and a broad range of Enlightenment characteristics. A number of them can be considered in turn. Firstly was belief in scientific method. Both the evangelicals and the natural philosophers, the men of science of the 18th century, were concerned with experiment. Evangelicals called their faith experimental religion. Experiments would be conducted as much in religion as in science, since they explore more of the truths of Christian experience. Again, evangelicals wrote treatises called Enquiries. Carey's work that launched the Baptist Missionary Society was called An Enquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens. The key word enquiry is the one that Adam Smith chose for his influential work, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, 1776. Their intellectual method was the same: inquiry, investigation, empirical technique. Missiology and economics converged in their approach because theology overlapped with natural philosophy. Thomas Chalmers, the leader of the early 19th century evangelicals in the Church of Scotland, delivered his most powerful sermons not on some subject of central theological concern, but on the wonders of the heavens. His astronomical discourses of 1817 illustrate that there was no gulf between science and religion. Likewise, Benjamin Rush, a leading physician in post-revolutionary America and a disciple of Jonathan Edwards, integrated the study of physiology thoroughly with theology. That synthesis was typical of the age. Science and theology were pursued by the evangelical Enlightenment mind as branches of a common philosophical pursuit. The second feature of the period was optimism. The later Enlightenment typically supposed that the future holds great promise for humanity. It was at this time that the idea of progress came to birth, teaching that if sufficiently enlightened, human beings would advance not just in knowledge, but also in morality towards a better future. The general optimism of the age was shared by evangelicals. More will in the end be saved than will perish, said Thomas Scott, a leading Anglican evangelical, in 1802. Diseases, wars, passions will all be subdued. An American follower of Edwards was more precise. He calculated that the ratio of the lost to the saved at the end of time were with the order of 1 to 17,456 and 1/3. That was optimism of a high order. Hope for the future commonly took a doctrinal form. Post-millennialism, the belief that the second coming of Christ will take place only after, post, 1,000 years of beatitude on earth, became widespread among evangelicals. It was held that the present will merge indistinguishably into the blessed future of the millennium. Evangelicals spoke of the glory of the latter days. Some of the impetus for overseas missions sprang from the expectation that the spread of the gospel throughout the world will usher in the millennium. Missionary work would accomplish the Christian hope. Post-millennialism was a Christian equivalent of the idea of progress. It was a facet of the optimism of the times. Thirdly, there was moderation. This trait was perceptible in the theology of John Wesley. His Arminianism was recognisably similar to the latitudinarianism of broader-minded Anglicans. In both, there was an assertion of human free will, although Wesley insisted on divine sovereignty over all. What is less frequently noticed is that the Calvinist tradition among evangelicals also became moderate. That term was occasionally used. Moderate Calvinism was the characteristic doctrinal position of evangelicals both in the Church of England and in Orthodox dissent. Following Jonathan Edwards, it avoided declaring that those who refused the gospel were condemned by the Almighty to perdition. Rather, persistent sinners were responsible for their own rejection of divine grace. Some were prepared to say that there was little distinction between Wesley's Arminianism and this form of low Calvinism. The Anglican Thomas Hawes, for example, remarked that he wrote his biblical commentary as a Calvinist, but that he hoped it would be entirely acceptable to a spiritually minded Arminian. Moderate Calvinists dropped the elaborate distinctions that had so marked the weightier Puritan works of the 17th century, and so adopted a much simpler type of doctrinal exposition. They adopted the Enlightenment quality of clarity, dwelling on the basic teachings of the Bible. Moderation was their lodestar. In the fourth place, ethics was stressed. 18th century churchmen of the latitudinarian school often urged morality and little else on their congregations. As upholders of the established church, they called upon parishioners to perform their duty to their social superiors and the king. As classical scholars, many wanted to explain the moral principles of the Stoic school to their hearers. Evangelicals, by contrast, were not content with preaching duty or stoicism, believing that they must proclaim the gospel. Yet they emphasized the responsibilities of their congregations to conduct themselves in accordance with the moral law. A few evangelicals lapsed into antinomianism, belief that believers were freed by grace from the obligation to keep the law. And many critics of the evangelicals contended that if they proclaimed salvation by faith rather than by works, they were undermining the basis of society. So evangelicals were eager to show that they too upheld the moral law. George Whitefield, the great revivalist preacher on both sides of the Atlantic, characterized true religion as a universal morality founded upon love of God and faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. Religion, by this definition, is essentially morality. The ethical thrust of evangelical teaching was shared with broader churchmen who were also swayed by Enlightenment preoccupations. Fifthly, there was pragmatism. The Enlightenment encouraged those who fell under its sway to modify traditions in order to increase effectiveness. The principle of utility was a guiding light, and not just among utilitarians. What was useful was best. Likewise, evangelicals at the time praised ministers if they were useful. They were often prepared to adapt their practice to circumstances. A pragmatic temper is sometimes supposed to have been a feature of religion in the New World, especially on the American frontier. In America, there were fewer hampering traditions to overcome, and so experimentation was possible. Yet evangelicalism in Britain, as well as America, was marked by adaptability. Field preaching outside church buildings, perhaps the most characteristic strategy for spreading the gospel adopted by Whitefield and Wesley, was a pragmatic measure. It was a break with church order, the way in which things ought to be done. Again, lay agency, the principle that ministry should not be confined to the ordained, was marked among evangelicals. Chalmers, for example, introduced deacons alongside elders in his Glasgow congregation in 1819, so that more businessmen could be church officials. In the same spirit, many Baptists abandoned their insistence on believer baptism as a condition of sharing in communion in order to fraternize with other evangelicals. There was a willingness to breach traditions for the sake of furthering the gospel. Evangelical pragmatism was an expression of the spirit of the age. Matters of taste, sixthly, were also affected. Evangelicals were by no means cultural Philistines. After all, they frequently wrote literature themselves. William Cowper, one of the most eminent poets of the later 18th century, was an evangelical who lived at the home of John Newton, the leading evangelical clergyman. Cowper identified elegance with simplicity, an instance of the adoption of the classical ideals that were favoured by the authors of the Enlightenment age. Similarly, the buildings erected by evangelicals of the period normally possessed classical features in their design. Columns, pediments, and symmetrical windows adorned their meeting houses. Another typical product of the movement was hymnody, again often displaying classical features. Charles Wesley, the most distinguished hymn writer of that or any other age, wrote verse that brilliantly combines biblical allusions with disciplined emotion and terse phraseology. Consider, for example, the striking line, "Impassive he suffers, immortal he dies." The condensed paradox succinctly expresses something of the achievement of the cross. The style is that of the Augustan moment in English literature that was itself a manifestation of Enlightenment taste. Evangelicals expressed themselves in the idiom of the age. In the seventh place, there was reform. The Enlightenment was normally associated with efforts to uproot abuses and eliminate oppression. Evangelicals, it must be admitted, were not all noted for their reforming zeal in the politics of the 18th and early 19th centuries. John Wesley, for example, was a resolute Tory who condemned the American Revolution. Nevertheless, the spirit of reform was powerful among English dissenters who were caught up in the evangelical movement. Their watchword in politics was civil and religious liberty. In America, Isaac Backus, a leader of the Baptists, was an ardent champion of the separation of church and state and of other radical causes. Toleration was valued by evangelicals in general, Anglican as well as dissenting. They spoke of their admiration for John Locke's published work, A Letter Concerning Toleration, 1689. Most remarkable was the way in which evangelicals threw their energies into the cause of anti-slavery. Because they accepted the common Enlightenment ideals of benevolence, happiness, and liberty, all of which pointed towards freeing enslaved persons from being treated as mere articles of merchandise, evangelicals had a natural affinity for the campaign against slavery. Their activism placed them in the vanguard of the movement. Under the leadership of the redoubtable evangelical politician William Wilberforce, they were the chief agents in the abolition of the British slave trade in 1807, and they went on to achieve the ending of slavery in British dominions by Act of Parliament in 1833. Evangelicals joined in the reforming impulse which is a characteristic of the Enlightenment period. It is hard to resist the conclusion that early evangelicals were immersed in the Enlightenment. They were participating fully in the progressive thought of their age. At this point, however, there is a need for caution. Evangelical Christianity cannot be reduced to Enlightenment categories of thought. There was a difference between their balance of values. Contrast became apparent over time as Enlightenment thought spread to more and more sections of society during the 19th century. An element in its principles, the axiom of free inquiry, remained potent. The spirit of investigation was to be utterly unfettered. It was held that a condition of progress in any field of research is a total lack of presuppositions. Contention arose that basic Christian doctrines cannot be assumed even in theological exploration. Thus, when in 1879 Alexander Raleigh addressed the Congregational Union in England on the changed aspects of evangelical faith, he argued that evangelicalism had abandoned its belief in authority in favour of the principle of free inquiry. He meant the preconceptions derived from the Bible were not to override the results of allegedly scientific investigation. The result of the exaltation of apparently value-free scholarly research to that level was an erosion of doctrinal conviction and even of the gospel message itself. The emphasis on free inquiry was being placed above one of the four evangelical characteristics, biblicism. It led to the acceptance of hypotheses about biblical criticism that undermined the authority of Scripture. Ultimately, Enlightenment thought proved to be a solvent of evangelical priorities. The process took place, however, not in the 18th, but in the later 19th century. Before that, the marriage of evangelicalism with the Enlightenment gave the movement a powerful public appeal. Those who shared Enlightenment values were also attracted to the gospel. The evidence reviewed here shows that on the one hand, the Enlightenment was not necessarily anti-religious, and that on the other, evangelicalism was not just a matter of feeling opposed to the reason of the Enlightenment. Enlightenment and evangelicalism were for a long time close allies. It is often supposed otherwise. Christian apologists have frequently seen the Enlightenment as an exercise in religious scepticism, irredeemably hostile to the gospel. Even perceptive writers like Leslie Newbigin, former bishop of the Church of South India, analysed the non-Christian assumptions of the late 20th century as the baleful results of the Enlightenment. But Newbigin neglected the extent to which evangelicalism was blended with the Enlightenment in earlier days. He also criticised that school of thought for being intrinsically anti-Christian. It's true, as we've just noted, that eventually assumptions deriving from Enlightenment thought were solvents of the gospel message. Yet the movement was not in itself an enemy of the faith. The two were entirely compatible with each other. Their simultaneous rise was actually an advantage for the gospel. It follows that aspects of the Enlightenment project can be retrieved for contemporary evangelicalism. Scientific investigation need not be considered as primarily a threat to Christian belief. The Research Scientists' Christian Fellowship, now Christians in Science, was offered standing testimony to the compatibility of science and religion. Hope for the future, moderation in the statement of doctrine, and moral guidance can be valuable assets in commending evangelical teaching. A pragmatic temper can help the progress of the gospel by avoiding placing unnecessary obstacles in its path. Even in matters of taste, there may be resources for the present. It would be an immense loss if the hymnody of the Evangelical revival disappeared from the regular singing of Christian congregations. And perhaps most of all, it needs to be recalled that the spirit of reform is not alien to the evangelical movement. It would not need to be harnessed for other political ends. Evangelicalism can be on the same side as such ideals as scientific investigation, hope for the future, and humane reform. If these are the values of a rational human being, they can also be the values of the evangelical Christian. The present, as in its origins, evangelicalism can be identified with progressive thought. Thank you very much.